one then? And it's going to be for final, absolutely no more updates, promise.
_final.
The end. Let's see if I can help. Yeah. So I'm not going to use the latest event PPT. Oh, Phil, convert to PDF for me. No. So, oh yeah, you did. So yeah, it's PDF. So is it the latest event PPT minus William's example? Is that the one I'm going to use?
Subject line.
Yeah, that's all it.
385K.
Okay.
I got it, so you don't have it yet?
That was the penultimate.
I don't know.
Just do a get messages, see if it's... Because I got it like 5 seconds, 10 seconds ago.
There it is.
That's the one.
All right.
Sure.
All right. And Jeff is leaving the room as we're getting started. Bye, Jeff. All right. Welcome to SCIM. For those of you who are here for SCIM, that is. For those of you who are here to read the email in a quiet place, feel free to do so too. So we actually have a the agenda posted is mostly about recharter discussion, and we actually have one presenter here. We have Phil who's going to talk to us a little bit about ID events, but our next step for this working group is to figure out what to do next, and that's sort of the context you should be. That's how you should be looking at this. Phil has some ideas. Other people have proposed, various extensions to SCIM and various work. Some of you have stuff lying around in your sort of on your hard disks that look like SCIM extensions. This may be the time to sort of let some of those things bubble up to the surface, and sort of so we can possibly have a discussion in this working group about where we go next. I'm not saying we have to recharter today, but in the not too distant future, we have to figure out the way to recharter this working group, close it down, or do something else, because our core documents are done, and sort of at present we don't have any outstanding deliverables. All right. So Phil has some stuff he wants to talk to us about. But we hope to leave time in open mic for people to talk about their other stuff. Okay, Phil. You got to stand in the pink box, because
I'm forced to use the box now.
Yeah, you got to stand in the box.
Cool.
got to be in the box, and we have a remote. We do actually have a couple of remote participants, so we might have people on the remote queue talking to us.
Had we had enough planning, this presentation was actually going to be an identity events BOF. The suggestion was made, since it's related, SCIM has an interest, we could do it here. So we wanted to bring you up to date on some discussion a bunch of us have been having. We can go to the next slide. That started in Tokyo about defining events. And I'll go through and do a bit of a level set. For those that don't know, many of you do. Talk about why it's different from, say, SCIM itself, why it matters that we do this, and why is it useful. We have 3 drafts that have been submitted to get things started. They're very rough. It has been some good input from William and Morteza and myself, so there is some experience here, but we're not really at the stage where anybody has any realistically working code. People do have working architectures that's similar, and there's a desire now to standardize that, and that's where we're at today. Next slide. So some background. As I mentioned, what came up in Tokyo is a number of us were talking about event-like things. We're hearing discussion about how can we send logout notices asynchronously? How can we do token revocations asynchronously rather than doing an introspection lookup on every request? There is the risk working group in the Open Identity Foundation, which is looking to send security information between providers that would help deal with issues like people use a recovery account at another email provider to recover their account. And then we know the Matt Honan story where hackers were able to leverage the fact that people use the same information across multiple providers, and that in itself causes problems. So maybe, I don't know if William, if you want to talk more to risk, but a little later on, there's all of that. There's SCIM. There's some event scenarios where we want to notify another party where we've provisioned to possibly in the past of a change we'd like to make. But sometimes it's not practical to actually send a REST command, and I'll explain why those situations come up. There's the HEART working group, and I don't know much about that, but they expressed an interest here as well. The other thought, I mean, the consensus that, the informal consensus that happened in Tokyo is, hey, maybe we can use JOT for this. It's a portable format. We've got signing and encryption. Let's use that. With the caveat that there's no confusion that these are sign-on assertions or sessions. We have to make that clear. Next slide. So where REST protocols transfer state from clients to servers, an event is really just a statement that a state change has occurred. We can make some kind of qualifier about that state. This is a new resource. This subject has been modified. An account takeover event has occurred. Any number of things that might be important to security could be expressed. One thing we want to say clearly is that this isn't a way to do RPC. These are not commands. These are simply one server saying to another, this has happened, and I'm sending it to you because you've registered an interest in knowing. It does a number of cool things when you don't use a command, is by having the sender simply say, this happened. It's up to the receiver, the subscriber, to decide what to do about it. That makes your error signaling problems go away. It also gets you away from the RPC question. So the way to think about an event is simply a statement about a statement of fact about a change that's occurred with a publisher, and they're now notifying a subscriber that this has happened, and it's happened in the historical context. Might be near real time, but it's historical. Next slide.
I did give you next slide, right?
Did you? Okay.
That was the slide
sorry.
we're on, and this
I
is
guess the
next.
same title. So for now, the drafts we're writing are focused on identity events. So what's unique about identity? I think the observation is that whether our systems are tightly coupled or loosely coupled or not coupled at all, because we're often talking about the same people, there are cross-system effects that occur because the same claims are known to multiple parties. So whether that was done through intent, because a provisioning system connected those systems, or whether it's because it's the same person that two parties happen to know about, there could be security issues at play that are of concern. And that raises the reason why the risk work came about, and it raises the issues for SCIM. At the same time, we want to do it in a way that wouldn't be great if Google started telling people, other providers, about all sorts of stuff, these changes in detail that the other party shouldn't know about. So the great thing is it turns out that there's a way to express events that really reduces the amount of information flowed to a minimum, and that we get the idea that the subscriber only actually gets the data or confirms the data based on what they already know. Next slide. Oh, question?
Yeah, Patrick Linsky from Cisco. Regarding the privacy, rather than trying to deal with state propagation and in particular around the notification topic that we were just discussing, getting it right for notifications is really hard, and just not having the data in the notifications at all is a very appealing approach, because it's much harder to screw up if you just, like, rather than, I think it'd be very worthwhile to characterize minimum in the case where we're pushing data in particular.
Mm-hmm. Sometimes you have a choice. There are different scenarios that I've observed where all that needs to happen is to say the state of this record has changed. Then it's up to the subscriber to decide what to do. If they need more information, there's nothing saying they can't do a callback and say, give me the current state, do an HTTP GET, pull that record back. At that point, the cool thing is normal access control kicks in, normal information filtering kicks in, and we do that. We don't have to build those security measures in the event system. So the ideal case is you give minimal information, but you're also weighing a performance and privacy consideration. If there's for example, an enterprise to the cloud, there's a tight contractual relationship, and the enterprise is asserting control over the cloud, and there may be a performance concern. So it may be valid in some cases to pass raw data, but in other cases, particularly when it's cross-cloud and a completely decoupled environment, instead of passing data across, we might pass a hash across that says, if you have an identifier that matches this hash, and William will show you that example, you might care about that. And that way we get out of the issue of, can we expose that piece of raw information, like an email address, or not? And so the other party has to know about it for it to make sense or to be an issue. But at the same time, we've conveyed the security event without conveying information.
Yeah, I think those sorts of approaches are really strong. We've done some other things along those lines.
Yeah,
I think anytime we talk about getting PII into any of these notifications, I think it's really important to also talk about how we can just avoid that PII.
Yep.
Thanks.
Well, that didn't render too well.
No.
So the only thing here is that I was sort of seeing a full spectrum of systems that share common data that have no relationship, active relationship, they're completely decoupled. And that's the case might be where Google's letting Yahoo know of a security event that they might care about, even though there's no provisioning relationship in place. To the other extreme, where an enterprise is saying, I want to sync my directory with this cloud, and I want them to look exactly the same, so a tightly coupled environment. Yet it turns out that events could be useful in all these domains. Next slide. I think these are all points I think I've covered.
I was wondering whether we have actually examples for some of those cases, because like they may help us to understand like what information needs to be passed around and what the implication is of that information. Because I can imagine if there's, for example, in the Google Yahoo case, I wonder, like, it obviously, like, I'm sure there's a lot of difference between what is passed around, because hopefully not my user accounts and so on, because what would Yahoo do with that? I don't have accounts on both sides, and so
we have a good use
granularity may be
case.
very different.
We have a good use case.
Hannes.
William Nance from Google, just to take that question. And this is just a completely straw man implementation, but if you have an agreement to share signals between two companies about their mutual users, you could build that list using like a privacy preserving hash or something, so you would know who the Yahoo users were at Google, for example, and vice versa, and then only share those risk signals when you know that it's actually that user. So there is an example coming up.
Yeah. About, sorry.
I'm just gonna go stand in the audience for a while. So there is I just want to point out that there is a difference between the engineering approach and the legal approach here, right? So whatever we say about, as engineers and as engineers building an engineering solution to this problem, it might be a big difference between sending a reference and sending the data, right? From the legal point of view, at least in the EU, it doesn't make a hell of a lot of difference. It's still PII, right? Doesn't actually matter, right? Yeah. But that means that we have to figure out when we're building the architectures for information flow architectures, they have to be able to support directed as well as publish subscribe models, I think, because there are certain deployment situations where information sharing over a bus would be problematic. Right?
Sure. One of the things I hope in the initial sort of idea we put forward is that there is a delineation between a base token format, which just says, here's how you express an event. And then I put forward a proposal for what a set of SCIM events might be that is a profile of identity events. That helps in a couple of ways in that the rules and the privacy considerations really depend on the overall data situation that you're dealing with. So in some sense, the risk events are dealing with a different set of problems. They're still events than say what SCIM's dealing with or what OAuth is dealing with, trying to revoke a session or a token. And the great thing is by separating those out, the one advantage is that you can deal with the privacy and the security considerations of each without having to deal with it in one big spec. That said, on the surface, when we're looking at it now, there is some overlap, and that's kind of interesting too. There's another problem too when a lot of people are focused on when I'm going cross-domain, what's one of the challenges for SCIM exactly when the state isn't quite the same? And I give the example of, say, Oracle and Salesforce. The number of users we have are probably a superset of our users that also use Salesforce. And so we could have a situation where one service provider changes a user and adds CRM user to their roles. And the intent is that an event goes off or command goes off to Salesforce. And if we expressed it as a SCIM command saying, modify Alice, give her CRM user with the intent to set her up with a CRM account, Salesforce might go, error, who's Alice? And the event model says, we've changed the entitlements to this subject identifier. We know you care, so here it is. And then Salesforce, as the receiver of the event, says, oh, we don't know what this identifier is. First of all, we have to resolve that identifier. Then we decide what to do. And the idea here is that the receiver of the event decides what to do, and then based on what they're allowed to know, they discover that information. So it becomes self-resolving. So I've mentioned this before. The event model lets us reduce error signaling, lets us reduce the actual event payloads, the amount of data we transfer. We did a discussion years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, about how would we do cross-provisioning between SAML providers. We wrote essentially the REST side to SAML. It fell flat on its face because the security paradigm of SAML is really not to reveal anything. If you're not supposed to know about a set of claims, it's not going to confirm that those claims don't exist. That caused all sorts of problems with modify, create, and all these other commands. IDPs run completely independently, and they act independently, so it's hard to send commands. So events become a way to do this. So there's 3 current drafts that we've published. These are just to get discussion going. The first one is the identity token event format that's based on JOT. It does show a couple of example events, but those aren't normative. The intent is that another draft like the ID event SCIM draft would say this is what it means for SCIM. I would expect OpenID would publish in the future a risk event draft that extends the ID event token draft. And then to get discussion going it's all good to have an event token, but how do we propose they be delivered? I've had lots of conversations with many people, and there's many different cases, and Leif just raised the question, is it point-to-point? Is it a bus? The answer is I've heard all sorts of needs and requirements. So what I'd like to see is, to start with, is an HTTP post profile and an HTTP get profile. One allows us to deliver an event to a registered endpoint that somebody's provided, and we can just post the events. The other one is a polling model, so an enterprise can go back to the cloud and say, have you got any events? And there are trade-offs with each. There's also web push, and there's all sorts of other models to look at. So what's the identity event token? It's just a JOT token. It reuses all the JOT attributes and really only defines one attribute, but then we create what I call an attribute bag so that each event can have its own set of attributes without having to worry about collisions between other event definitions. Oh, that's kind of small. So up here, the event URI.
Mike. Yeah, you can bring it, but use the point. There's a laser thing in the jig.
Oh, is there? There it is. Oh, better. We're getting sophisticated at the IETF. There can be some debate as to what the format, whether it's a URN, a URI. I'm not hung up on that. I just followed what SCIM and OAuth were using. So in this case, this would be a SCIM create event is being indicated. The issuer is this is the publisher. The audience in this case, I've defined it as saying the audience is this event went out on these 2 feeds. So those people that have subscribed to these feeds are the audience for this event. Now, it doesn't have to be a feed. It could be some other thing entirely. Then to convey the attributes, SCIM would define for itself the set of attributes and how it wants to do this. I just took this based on like a SCIM bulk event format and copied that. But it could be any other design, and the SCIM working group may change that. The main point is that the event can contain anything it wants to contain based on what that standard track wants to do. And here's a risk event if you want to talk to that, William.
All right, William Dennis again. So again, this is just kind of a straw man example, but here we have the URN for risk for a particular event signal of risk, and then what did you call it? The attribute to kind of bucket, which can bag, which can contain kind of all the details of the event. In this case, like a hash of the email. And to the earlier question, only like this assumes there's a pre-established relationship with risk. So we're only sending this event to people that we know actually care about this user. And to take it back a little bit, I guess, to explain what risk is. So we noticed that there's kind of an informal relationship between providers of identity. Say a user may use a particular email address from one provider as a recovery option at a different provider. And what this event here is an example of is if that one of those providers reassigns that email address, we kind of want to tell the other provider, hey, you might want to like drop this email as a recovery option because it's actually been reassigned. So this is just an example of what that event would look like to sort of tell the other provider, hey, you might not want to rely on this this one anymore. Tony?
Tony Nadlin. I'm just trying to figure out some use cases for this. I'm not sure if you're after synchronization, if you're after something else with these events. I mean, we're interested in finding out what has changed, but we don't want to receive individual events for everything that changes. We find that very networking and very cumbersome to deal with, right? So, we have a draft out there on polling, and it's basically to get everything that you watermark there back, right? And so I'm still trying to figure out what the main driver is. Besides, I can see if you're after account compromise and stuff, that might be interesting. But from a SCIM point of view, I'm trying to figure out what you're really after here.
So I think that there are two orthogonal problems there. This particular draft, the event type, doesn't really go into how it's distributed. And I think the polling mechanism is quite legitimate. I guess you could use, the JTI, or you could have another serial or some serial number in there or something. But I think that's why, Phil, you intentionally kind of kept the draft separate, so we can have like, well, this is what the event looks like, and then sort of separately, this is how it's delivered. So I think risk is, I don't even know how risk is going to be delivering these events. It could be a polling mechanism. But yeah, the idea of this draft is just to say, well, if we're all kind of processing these events, can we have like one representation of them?
Yeah, Dick Hart. So that was my question. Is it you're trying to standardize how an event to be the same kind of event, whether it was over risk or over SCIM?
Right.
Okay.
That's the goal of the ID event draft. So this draft is just fairly standalone and can be used separately. And the goal is just to see, I think at this stage, kind of, is the risk working group interested in using a common format, and will this format work?
I would say the other uniting quality is that for the receivers of these events, they're all arriving asynchronously. So you have situations where I might have positive control with Salesforce, and I can send them all the changes I want. But since they're an independent organization and they have changes that they know we care about, but they don't know the state of our data, what they might want to do is send us back an event that says, we've changed this. So if you care about it, you can decide what to do. So those situations come up in SCIM. So we always have the choice of a SCIM REST command, or there's an asynchronous quality to it that I still want to know about, that the other party has changed state.
I don't understand your example yet. So maybe you can clarify that a bit as to who's doing what and what's going where.
So the issue is that I might have positive control over Salesforce, and my customers that are at Salesforce, this is hypothetical. So let's say I do, and I can send them all the commands I want, REST commands to transfer the state I want to give to Salesforce, and they follow our commands and do it. Yeah. But let's say Salesforce, being Salesforce, makes independent changes, and that's a realistic thing. And some of those changes have impacts back to the provider of that, or basically to our enterprise customer. So the question is, should Salesforce do a SCIM REST command back to us and then we get into complex error signaling situations? Or does Salesforce simply say, we've changed their role, so you might want to know about it because you're paying for it, that kind of thing. So that's what this sets up, is the ability for an asynchronous callback to let another party that you're working with know about a state change. At a high level, it's happening asynchronously. It's still a synchronous protocol call, yes. Does that make sense?
You're thinking this as another out-of-band SCIM mechanism to signal somebody, say, you maybe want to go look at something.
Yes, that's one possibility.
Mortezan, sorry, I think there might be a bit of a confusion here, sort of just kind of step back and do a bit of a history on this. So last year, one of the extensions for SCIM that we sort of started thinking about and we proposed, we wrote the draft for, was the event notification. That started a bunch of discussion that, hey, we have the need around sort of notification of events for a whole bunch of other identity-related stuff that has nothing to do with events like single logouts, token revocation, blah, blah, blah type of problems. So one of the things that happened, we created a mailing list sort of, on the IETF to, what was it called? The ID event notification or ID events or whatnot. And there was a bunch of discussion, and the result of that was, okay, instead of sort of worrying about SCIM as one event notification model just for SCIM, let's just define an ID event system, and then one of the profiles of that becomes SCIM. So and then another example that we sort of wrote up the draft is the risk as another example. And there could be a whole bunch of additional profiles for it. So the overall ID event type itself has nothing to do with SCIM. SCIM is just one of the consumers of that. And I think that's one of the reasons that we're confusing these two, because a lot of the examples, a lot of discussion is around SCIM, but it's not just for SCIM. Does that help a bit with sort of understanding?
You could define events for an entirely different purpose that makes sense. I think you had the case of updating apps.
I'm trying to understand the use cases where you're expecting to use
Right.
Right.
For the SCIM profile, that's the example that, for example, you were just using with sort of Oracle and Salesforce, or you can pick any other sort of, enterprise or service providers, or service provider to service provider, cloud provider to cloud provider as examples of that.
So this is a bit detailed, but this might,
So you're speccing the event itself.
yeah.
And then,
What's the event
And
format?
then how you move it, like any pub sub mechanism to how do you get it, is you consider that out of scope of what you're writing right now.
Yeah, I would expect different standards organizations or different work groups are going to take that JOT format and decide what's appropriate for their scenario. So you could have somebody who says, I want to deliver events to mobile apps, say I'm going to use web push, and we have our own set of events that we're going to do, and that's fine. I think the reason why I've said identity events is what links it together is because the notion that identity events seem to occur across parties that are even not actively cooperating with one another. There's no relationship other than they want to do something about security. And that's kind of where risk is at. Risk is almost, you could have a partner where all they do is agree to share events, but there's no other relationship.
Well, they are cooperating.
Right, but on the loosest level possible, right? The fact that my email address appeared at both service providers was due to the user's actions, not by actions of the service providers. That's what I mean by completely loosely coupled, no coupling. This is an example of an event. I apologize, it's so small with the distance. The idea here is that we could have a standardized event. This is like a password reset event, but an enterprise might find that in their environment, they want to carry extra data. So I might want to say, keep track of the number of reset attempts. So the standard event is simply to say there was a reset attempt against this account, and I'm notifying some systems. They might want to reset tokens or do other things. And here we want to keep track of the number of resets. There might be an argument to include all that as an optional feature that SCIM decides to do, or they might not. But what I'm opening the door for is that there's no reason why events can't be extended themselves. The last step then is when you go to deliver it, it's bundled up as a JOT, and basically all we do is we have an attribute with a multi-valued array, and we can convey multiple events in one message. This could be delivered by HTTP post, HTTP GET, or anything you want to use. Some questions sort of we're thinking about. We've heard requirements for all sorts of distribution schemes. And the question is, what do we want to standardize, if anything? How far do we want to go? Tony talked to me about looking up, or he mentioned earlier about watermarks or looking up by date or by e-tag. Is that something? The downside that some of us talked about 4 or 5 years ago is coming out of the directory world. We wanted to avoid the change log style where history is there, the entire history of any server is there, and because the entire history is there, then only truly trusted godlike clients can read that part on LDAP. That was one of the downside, was a huge security problem. And one of the things Chuck expressed was, Chuck Mortimer from Salesforce, was to avoid too much history keeping where I could get events from a year ago. That might not scale well. So the idea is that here's an event, we deliver that, and then we can forget about the event. Other than our own audit trails, from a protocol perspective, the publisher can forget about the events once it's delivered. I think another issue that's missing, that's not defined, is how can a subscriber know that it missed an event if something went wrong, and so forth.
Yeah, Tony Nedlin, on that one, we're interested in specific objects that may have changed given a watermark time, and the watermarks can be reset at any time. So we're not always going back to the going through years worth of history. This is very short, very short-lived data, and we're using it, to figure out between instances what may be off on one instance versus the other instances, and getting events cause us a little bit of problem.
Yeah, I agree. That's why watermarking is better than, say, like the old LDAP thing. If I go, give me all the changes since such and such a date, you have to know that, whereas the watermark approach says what watermarks are actually different than what these are.
Incidentally, this is what CT does, right, for certificate transparency, Merkle trees, right?
I can't make that out.
I think that's, so one approach to doing that is to look at Merkle trees, probably, because that provides you a way to prove that you've got an entire history of something, basically, right? But so you have a trusted third party that keeps track of hashes of your objects, basically.
Sure.
Certificate transparency. This is exactly certificate transparency, right? If you want to spend the power consumption of Denmark doing this, yes, absolutely.
We also have a remote participant, Sarah.
Certificate transparency. This is exactly certificate transparency.
Go ahead.
If you want to spend the power consumption of Denmark doing this, yes, absolutely.
You're up, Sarah Squire.
We also have a remote participant, Sarah.
Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Squire. Sorry, I'm on a little bit of a delay. So one of the use cases that we've been looking at that hasn't been brought up yet is the issue of consent and consent receipts. And specifically in a healthcare context, we're interested in... Hi, everybody. This is Sarah Squire. Sorry, I'm on a little bit of a delay. we're interested in the concept of patients being able to consent through a loosely coupled IDP and RP to their data being used for research, and to be able to revoke that consent in real time. And there's no mechanism right now in OAuth for patients to be able to do that. So we're hoping that ID Event can solve that problem. We're interested in the concept of patients being able to consent through a loosely coupled IDP and RP to their data being used for research, and to be able to revoke
Sarah
that consent
was
in
listening
real
to
time.
herself
And
with
there's
a
no
delay there.
mechanism right now in OAuth
I
for
think what I
patients to be able to do
understood
that.
was
So we're
that
hoping that ID Event
something
can solve
had
that problem.
happened. And at some point later on, they want to be able to get a consent event so they can record that consent was collected from the user, possibly at a later date, and also that user may revoke consent in the future as well. So from the perspective of the provider that holds the data, these events might occur randomly to them, and you want a way to deliver those messages to say, this event's changed, this event has occurred. So I don't see any reason why that wouldn't work. I'm not sure whether there couldn't be just an endpoint to do that, and what would be the difference between a RESTful approach and an event approach. The event one, though, would give them the ability to send it like through a doctor's office or an agency where multiple handlers are going to pass it along, and that might be the issue. I'm speculating here, but Justin has spoken to these cases before.
Do you want to add to that, Sarah?
Okay. A couple of us have talked about, and this is more JOT related, the issued at value, if I understand JOT correctly, is the date that the JOT was minted. So there's some questions in large production systems whether the event, the date the event occurred versus the time it gets published, with JOT, there might be a delay, seconds, minutes. We don't know. Just a place mark for an issue that we might need another attribute that says the event occurred at, and then this JOT was issued at. Some trade-offs there. I think the reasoning, and maybe Mike or John can explain, if it's really important that issued at be the same date as, for example, the signature on the JOT. That's what I was thinking was relevant. If you're testing that the JOT is valid, is it important that the issued at correspond to the signature time?
That was certainly the intended usage.
I agree with that. If you start monkeying around with saying when the token was issued, you could wind up having all sorts of unintended consequences. If you want to say that the event was at a different time than the token was issued, it should probably be a different value rather than, people use issued at for cache control and deduplicating. Randomly changing around what appears to be the sequence of the packets might not be such a good idea.
Yeah. So I'm not sure what to think. I'd like to see one value, but it occurs to me we might need two, and I think it's worth thinking about.
So just a note here. I mean, we've got like about 20 minutes left, and that's fine, right? But it may not be the best use of our time to sort of just try to solve all aspects of ID events today, right? I mean, part of the discussion I'd like us to have is whether this work is worth doing, and if so, is it a SCIM extension item, or is it something else?
William, Dennis, just one quick comment. I agree with John. I think we should just define a new actual event timeline.
I think as to the point was made earlier about privacy considerations, I think this can get tricky. I haven't started looking at those, but I know there are going to be some. The way we'll have to capture this, and it might be good the way we've proposed to segment this out, that there'd be a core draft, and then there'll be a skim draft, and then the skim draft would deal with what are the considerations in the context of the skim environment, which may be entirely different than, say, the HART spec or the risk spec. So that gives us a good layering, if you will.
Right. So John Bradley, Ping. So different things using this may actually have different notions of what the event time is. So with risk, there's when did the event occur, when was it discovered, and when was the token issued? Those, in some contexts, are very important distinct values, whereas HART may have a somewhat different notion of what actually needs to be captured. That's why I wouldn't overload it. It probably is up to the individual. Risk should define, if they want to have the event was discovered at this time, the event actually occurred 2 months ago, et cetera. That should be a risk decision. I wouldn't overload the core protocol with trying to make assumptions about what those individual message formats want to be.
So one possibility then is if a protocol, let's say, takes SCIM, it wants to say when the change occurred from SCIM's perspective, it could go in the SCIM payload. And so that's a different value than the issued at time. And it might be relevant to SCIM infrastructure because that's the date that's on the server. If you query the record,
So again,
match there.
I'm gonna ask you guys to let's not dive in that deep into the details of ID events, right? Let's try to. I'm sure you have more slides and sort of.
No, that's
Okay, that's it. That's it.
I'm sort of going back to, those were sort of the groups we talked to so far. I think the question I have is, informally, is this a good start? And how would you guys like to see this move forward, if at all? Is this something, one of the questions could be, there's the core spec, we get the core spec done, and then the SCIM working group takes care of the SCIM profile. Another question could be, and I might be getting to your issue, Leif, that maybe we should be reconciling some of these high-end events where they look a lot the same. And is this the body to do that?
So this is just one individual observation, Leif Johansson. So just because it looks like you sort of culturally inherited some of the formatting conventions from SCIM, doesn't mean it has to be a SCIM working item or work group item, right? This could just as well be an ID event working group doing like a set of schema for identity events. And then, the SCIM working group can do a profile or a transport, something like that, right?
That was my guess, but I was kind of defer to you guys and the ADs as to
I don't know if
what's best.
Do we have both of our ADs here? Yeah. So I think this is a question for you guys. How would you prefer? Because there seems to be enough interest in the room to actually work on stuff like this. I mean, we'll do hums and shit, right? But I wouldn't surprise me if there's interest in working on this. So the question is this just because it happens to, there's a SCIM culture here, but there's nothing here that ties this to SCIM, right? How would you propose we work on this? Do we come back to you with a charter for a working group or what?
Are you asking whether it's SCIM recharting or whether it's a new working group forming?
I guess I'm actually saying both if we're going to do this, because I think SCIM needs to do a profile document, right? Which means that at least SCIM needs to recharter to deliver that, right? But the question is whether the core work items that relate to the schema of ID events and, what do you need to do in order to profile this for your transport, stuff like that, right? Should that happen in SCIM? I don't see that as a logical, I don't see the logic of that, but here's where you step.
Is the group of people going to be the same? In both cases, or largely the same?
I actually don't think so. I think there are lots of new people in this room that are typically OAuth focused. I see OAuth people here that typically don't turn up for scheme working group meetings.
I think there's a small amount of work that needs to be done that's more cross work group required, and so there's a broader interest in it. And then, yeah, there are sub working groups like the SCIM working group that then want to take that right away and profile it.
If you're just asking whether it's the same people who usually turn up for identity and security related events, yes, it is. Hell yeah.
I don't really mind 1 or 2 working groups, you know, it's a little bit extra paperwork, you know, if you want to reach out to one and form a new one, but.
So more people should have opinions about this.
I personally think it would be good to have a separate working group. It could be created very fast with the help of the AD. The reason for this is that from a visibility and publicity point of view, if it's mungled somewhere into the milestone and charter text of this group, fewer people get to know about it versus if it's actually a dedicated group with the right title and so on. I think it's just from a visibility point of view, transparency point of view, much better.
Well, Dennis, I'll turn up wherever it is, so just let me know.
So, Tony Nedlin, I'm sort of inclined to say keep it in the SCIM working group, only because I think there's, you know, I'd like to make sure that we at least get some polling stuff that is integrated into these events and make sure all that stuff works in parallel. And to put it in another working group means, you know, you can do some coordination, and that always gets messy.
Yeah, it's Phil. I think to repeat, there's some element of that I agree with. There may be requirements that we would talk about in the SCIM working group that have to come back to the core. I think minimally we would have to commit to, if we keep them separate, we would have to commit to working on this simultaneously in both groups. And then that would work, that the SCIM working group, as is the risk and OpenID, would be part of the participants in the ID token group and provide that feedback. We need a way to do this or to do that that's missing. Mike?
Let's see, Mike Jones, Microsoft. Kind of independent of where the core work happens, the thing I would want for layering reasons is for the core spec to be distinct from the SCIM profile spec, to be distinct from HERT spec or an UMA spec, Lord knows what spec, right? I agree with you that you do want to have at least one of the profiles, maybe more, operating in parallel with the core spec, that the core spec likely would be very small and define one JOT claim and have some non-normative language talking about models that you could use for propagating such events, but leave it up to the profiles to define protocol messages for propagating them. Whether you want a working group for a doc that defines one claim, or whether you do that in the OAuth working group where we tend to define claims, is an open question in my mind.
Windows, I'm inclined to agree. I think it's a fairly straightforward spec. I hope I don't think we need to spend a whole lot of time working on it, so let's just get it done.
For instance, there's about to be RFC 7800, which defines the confirmation claim for proof of possession representation. We did that in OAuth.
Thorsten Morstedt. I would assume that a working group would not only define basic set of claims, but also define the distribution mechanism. I mean, the distribution mechanism should be the same, independent of the different schemes for the events or something like that. That would be very beneficial. Would be a reason to have a separate working group.
Yeah,
I don't think it's a good idea that every working group or every application defines new publication or distribution mechanisms. So for me, the benefit is to have such a distribution mechanism.
I would like to see a couple of methods defined as a base, and then maybe establish a registry so we don't close the door. We say it's there, but the idea would be, say, if you haven't got anything else in mind, here's a method that you can use that these events can be distributed with. How far we go with that and how much of a registry we need, I would like to get a lot more discussion on. For example, you know, what are the terminologies that we're using to describe such a relationship where somebody's publishing events, and do we need to standardize that or not? Right now in the distribution draft I put forward, I suggested a bunch of attributes, but it may not turn out to matter. I was talking with a few people that said a lot of this will be dealt with administratively and there isn't really an interop need. But at the same point, it's valuable to at least define the terminology. So we're all talking about the same things.
Thorsten again, I would expect more, not just attributes. I would expect a working group to define, as you have started to do, a mechanism for post messages, a mechanism for query and so on. So might probably based on existing mechanisms, but I think that would be beneficial, and I would very, I would support that.
Tony Nadlin to Torsten. From the SCIM perspective, there's already, I hate to use directory, but there's repositories that already have formats and ways to distribute these types of pub/sub stuff, and I'm not going to, have to recreate that in this area. That's, years worth of work that's gone into a lot of these pub/sub engines already. So if you want to do a profile of a pub/sub engine that may exist, I think that's fine. But to invent a brand new pub/sub protocol, I'm not sure is the right thing to do here.
Thorsten again. I'm one of the guys that typically does not turn up on a SCIM meeting, so I'm not so familiar with that. So if there is already a mechanism in SCIM to a pub/sub mechanism, why is there a distribution draft?
No, there isn't.
Oh, you're referring to proprietary mechanisms. It built into repositories.
Not referring to, Tony Nadlin, not referring to proprietary mechanisms, but there's mechanisms already out there that companies use for pub/subs that are standard, okay? Such as WSU
So,
QTT, yeah, the IBM has a whole MQ series that does events and all that.
Tony, we're down to 3 minutes now, and I want to get to some sort of sense of the room here. I'm going to ask try to formulate some questions here. So, the first question I think I'm going to ask is that, do you think the people in this room that identity events is a useful piece of work and that the IETF should work on it? Let's talk about where it gets done later. If you think that, if you think that ID events, roughly as described by Phil or some variant of it, is a useful thing and that the IETF should work on it, please hum now. All right. If you think it is not useful or that the IETF should not work on it, hum now. All right. It seems to be pretty strong consensus that there is something here. All right. Yes, Tony?
We have a third one that says we don't have enough information yet.
Yes, we can have that. So if you feel you don't have enough information or don't care about this stuff, please hum. All right. You guys are sitting way too close to the microphone. All right. I'm still saying it. There's reasonable consensus for that. There is something here that should be worked on in the IETF. So the second question is,
Is this something we should extend the SCIM working group to work on? Or should we do a separate working group? So I'm going to do like a two-part hum here. Yes, Mike?
I think you should also ask if we should just do it in OAuth.
Well, that's a good point.
One, because it's just defining a claim.
Yeah, that's a good point. So we have actually three options. You know, do it in SCIM, new working group, or do it in OAuth, right? And Barry is stepping up.
Or Jose.
This is Barry. Is new working group means shut down SCIM and charter?
No, I'm not. I actually want to treat this as separate from shutting down SCIM because
enough of an answer. That's all.
All right. New working group, you know, as in propose and charter and work on a new charter and for new working group to do ID event core, maybe other things around that. Work on it in OAuth and work on it in SCIM. So hum now if you like to work on this in SCIM. Right? All right, stop it.
Snap.
All right. Hum now if you want to work on this in OAuth. And hum now if you'd like the idea of working on this in a new working group. All right. All right. Hum now if you don't give a rat's ass. All right. So I hear a reasonable consensus again for working on this in a new working group, which means that we need to do like the usual charter dance, right? So we need to actually find volunteers to do that work. So hands up if you're willing to work on charter text for a new working group. All right. Take names. Torsten and Mike and John and okay, there's a fair number of people. Okay, and let's do this like it was above. Raise your hand if you're willing to write and or review drafts in that working group. Same people. All right, all right. You know, it's the usual suspects, you know, in the identity space in the IETF. So you know. The final hum here I would like to do is what we do with SCIM. So we haven't even got time to talk about other possible extensions that people could have lying around, right? So I'm just going to ask, do you want to? Well, I mean, we don't, but please. We are out of time, but you know, if 2 seconds, 1 second, maybe.
I'd like to be able to set up something so that you could go and do configuration of SCIM between a provider and a consumer of it, that we could standardize how that configuration would happen for exchange and setting up the relationship.
So here's what I'm going to say now is that we need to have a conversation on the mailing list, on the SCIM mailing list about, you know, future work items for SCIM. And that means that very concretely, if you do have IDs written up or ideas for stuff, you need to send it to the list, right? And you did, and yes, absolutely. There are 1 or 2 people who have actually done that, right? And this time around, we only got 1 hour, so we didn't have time, right?
I believe this is the third SCIM session, or this third IETF meeting that SCIM has been talking about what it's going to do in a charter. We need to
get to that point now. Yeah, and you know, an ID event working group could sort of buy us a little time because obviously we would have to do a profile and that would be a recharterable thing, right? But we actually have to recharter at this point. So me and Morteza will have to kick off. I think we'll have to kick off a conference call or two to actually talk about this in SCIM. Do you have anything else, Mr. Area Director, that you want us to cover before we let everybody go? All right. Okay. I think that the ID event people need to sit down with each other. Just because this was at a SCIM event doesn't mean that we're necessarily, the SCIM folks are leading this, right? You guys need to sit down and do a charter. Right.
And Barry, we wanted to thank you for helping us, supporting us from the BOF, all the sort of meetings, and
right.
My obligatory beer. Thank you so much. It's a proper thank you. It always is. Thank you.
Thank you, Barry. And we're done. So my blue sheet up here. Thank you.